Hey everyone, I'm Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From?
Today we're really excited to be talking about the new Netflix adaptation of Three Body Problem, which just released a few days ago. The reason why we're really excited to talk about it is I, for one, have been a huge fan of the Three Body Problem series, the books, forever. I probably read the full series at least 3+ years ago, and it was definitely a binge. Many people had told me about the first book. If you've seen the show now, you know what it's about. But if you had not seen the show before, you might have heard about this book. A lot of people who describe it may not have told you exactly what the plot was about, because when you read the book, it's not clear right away like what this story is necessarily about until you're maybe a third of the way through. Spoiler alert, it's about aliens. So when I heard that there was going to be a Netflix adaptation, I was stoked that they were going to do the adaptation, but I was always a little bit wary, as everyone always is when like it's a very well-loved book or book series that's going to be made for film or TV. There's always a hot chance of it getting totally ruined. And for better or for worse, the producers are the Game of Thrones people. And you know, Game of Thrones was amazing for the first several seasons, and it's still them that finished up the show. But that last season or two was pretty rough for Game of Thrones. I think everyone was a little like, take it with a grain of salt, let's see how this show turns out. But anyways, enough of my rambling introduction. We're talking about Three Body Problem today. Jesse and I watched only the first episode. Let's start with your thoughts, because you had a fresh slate, right? Like, you've never read the books prior to this. You have no baggage coming in. What were your first thoughts?
If I'm going to be really, really honest, I was interested, but it did not titillate me as much as I thought it would. I think it's just because the first episode had all these different plot points, and it wasn't that you got lost in it. Like, I feel like I kind of understood when I was in the past, when I was in the present, how the characters semi-connect. But it was, I was just kind of like, where's the point? And I feel like that's the trick with these like very operatic sci-fi alien stories, is like you have to give enough to move an intricate plot forward, but you also have to give enough that people who've never read the book — I have not read the book, I did read the Wikipedia, so I generally know what's happening, but the people who have not read the book are like excited about something. And so far it's just kind of like, I'm mystified, but I'm not like, oh my god, I need to find out more what's happening. Like, it's more just like, like, okay, that was a solid introduction, but I'm not like drawn all the way in.
That's interesting. Now that you say it like that, I guess I can see exactly what you mean. Like, I think my takeaway was that it was entertaining, and I'm interested enough to like finish the series. But I do agree with you. I guess the reason why I'm satisfied enough is because I already know what's going to happen. So I'm like, I get why this is happening. I get where this is going. Like, I'm interested to see how they represent this in the show. But for someone who has literally no skin in the game because you haven't read the books, it's many different subpoints that are introduced at the same time. And it's kind of like, why do I care about any of these necessarily? Like, not a single one of them is so compelling on its own that you're like, I'm definitely going to watch this show just for this part. I do think that's one of my biggest takeaways also from like watching this show as someone who has read the books, which is one of the biggest changes that they made. Well, there were many changes that they made, obviously. It's Hollywood. They're going to do what Hollywood going to do. But one of the major changes is that the main character is totally different. Not just casting wise. The main character is supposed to be Auggie in the show, that woman, the beautiful scientist woman, Auggie. But in the book, it's a man also, but it's Wang Miao is the name of that character. The reason why I say it's totally different is not just casting. In the show, it's actually maybe not very clear to you as someone who hasn't read the book that she's the main character, because there's a whole group of main characters in the show. There's this like friend gang, 6 people that are like friends that are all scientists, and they are like all helping each other, figuring out different things, different parts of the mystery kind of together. I understand why Hollywood would do this, because there's a very common theme of like the gang's all here kind of thing in a lot of these like shows. Stranger Things, for example, you love it because it's the group. You don't love like one particular person.
The interpersonal relationship and the drama around
exactly.
Yeah.
Someone's got your back and like, you know, that kind of feeling. And I do think maybe that's very Western or Hollywood. I get why they made it that way, but I will say when you read the book and it's just Wang Miao, you're like, oh my God, I'm so enthralled by this, right? Because he's the only person figuring out all of the shit himself. And the show, the part that I was like, was they really underplayed Augie's whole, like, she sees this numeric countdown wherever she's looking, whenever she opens her eyes. Yeah, she's like kind of bothered by it, but like it was such a small part of the first episode. In the book, it's like the first fucking 50 plus pages is Wang Miao just being like, how the fuck do I get this countdown to end? Like, what the fuck is going on? Like, he's going insane. He's by himself. He has no one else. There's no one he's like confiding in per se. He's just like being tormented by the aliens and doesn't know what the fuck's going on. He's the one that finds out about the video game thing. Like, everything that they've kind of diversified off into this group of friends is fully focused on this one human. So you're able to put yourself in the shoes of him being so tormented, trying to piece together all these like loose ends that you're like, okay, I have to know what happens. Versus in the show, to you, it feels like it's like all these random subplots that like don't necessarily have anything to do with each other because they've kind of divvied it all up between like multiple characters. Yes, of course, the like Cultural Revolution stuff is like, that was always a different character. So that was always a separate plotline. But I think the reason the show isn't as strong as I was hoping it would be, it's still good enough, but not as strong as I was hoping it would be, is that part of making one character into like 6 characters essentially really takes away the tension and the magnetic draw that you would have if you were reading the book.
Got it. I mean, I honestly didn't even know that. I just assumed that she was gonna die because of what was stated in the episode. Like, I just thought she was gonna die. But if we just walk through the layout of the episode, so at the very beginning, the episode begins with like a pogrom basically in China of intellectual folks, where the Red Guard, they're like hunting down intellectual folks and saying that they are traitors because they're proponents of like the Big Bang Theory or something like that. And I have to tell you, I was like, these Asian people are really angry. Like, it's actually really weird because there is such a lack of representation in Western media. Like, stuff like this, I feel like I don't see as much. So I was like, oh my God, they just beat this man to death. And everyone was just watching. I cannot really imagine, like, my parents living through something like that. It's just so bizarre. And then I was also like, wow, they really hate God. They like really hate God. I kind of know that about the Communist Party and how they try to, you know, they're crushing the Uyghurs and like the sinification of all the religions. But I was like, I did not realize how, and it's traumatized, but I didn't realize how much of a fervor that was. Like the anti-religious fervor was so strong.
Yes. I was also shook by watching them beat him to death. That was hard to watch. And honestly, I agree with you. It depends on what kind of media you're consuming though, right? So like from a Western audience standpoint, to your point of like what kind of roles Asian people get to play, they're probably not seeing like this amount of violence necessarily unless you're watching like kung fu movies or whatever. But I watch a lot of Asian content, so I'm kind of used to seeing like just all Asian casts doing whatever. But it still was very like visceral, the death. And honestly, the only thing I thought when I watched that scene was like, Game of Thrones people, of course you would, because Game of Thrones was all like crazy, shocking shit all the time. And I'm like, all right, I see the Game of Thrones elements here. So I will say the Cultural Revolution flashbacks, those were all very true to the book, and I felt really good about the way that they represented all of that. But yeah, it is kind of crazy, right? Because especially us being American born, we don't necessarily know all that history. Like, yes, we've like learned a little bit about the Cultural Revolution through like world history class or whatever, but we never delved super into it, and not to the point where we would understand kind of like the emotional motivations behind the Red Guard or anything like that, to the point that they'd be willing to kill people. I definitely thought that was very strong, and yes, shocking, but less shocking to me because I already knew what was going to happen.
So from that point, I think it moves on to the UK, where they start doing the murder investigations of the scientists, they were like flying in on the house of that guy who died, and I was like, Harry Potter, this is where the Dursleys live. I was like, the Dursleys are dead. They killed them. And that was my only takeaway from that. I was like, this is where they shot Harry Potter. I swear to God.
Or maybe you just think all of England, London
Probably.
looks like Harry Potter. So the biggest difference there is the book is set in China. I mean, it's written by a Chinese author and it's set in China. And they obviously changed the main setting to be in the UK, which makes it easier for them to cast all different looking types of people.
Diverse cast, yeah.
It's a very diverse cast, and I'm kind of like, whatever about it. Like, it's not true to the book, but if they're trying to appeal to mass audiences, I understand why they tried to change it up in that way. But the casting of the police officer, I'm gonna butcher it. Okay, look, in the book, right, everyone's name is Chinese, but it's written in Pinyin, so I can't necessarily tell what the, like, tones are. So I don't know, Da Shi, I think, is his name in the book, but he's played by Benedict Wong. Even when I saw it in the teaser, I was like, oh, that's good casting, because he actually like kind of fits what I imagine Da Shi to look like, kind of like a little bit goofy, a little bit like rough around the edges, a little gruff. So I thought that was good casting. But I think for me, since I'm talking about casting, I accept the diverse cast, even though it's not representing the book at all. But the thing that really a little bit bothered me is that I think Hollywood is in this weird space where it's doing a little bit too much like fan service towards a certain audience. Like, obviously you and I care about diversity, but I'm like, you don't need to beat it over my head, bitch. Like, I'm sorry, it's too many women. People are like, yeah, women traitor, whatever. But in the book, one of the other things where it felt like, oh, this person feels like a really strong character is the Cultural Revolution girl. That character, you don't know her yet very much in the show, in the first episode, but she's a very main character in the book. And one of the biggest appeals to me when I was reading the book was that she was a woman in this like very scientific field and becomes very prominent and powerful and like in a leadership role later on. And it felt very strong because she's one of like the only women in that space. So now I'm like, okay, you don't need to make everyone a woman. It was like the main characters already, like 2 of 6 of them are women. And then the part that really irked me was when Auggie has the countdown thing, right? And then her friend was like, did you go see the neurospecialist about it? What did he say? And she's like, what did she say? And I'm like, oh my God, shut the fuck up. I don't care that this anonymous neuroscientist was a woman, not a man. Like, this stuff really bothers me when they really try to like hammer it over your head. So
I actually did remember that. It was kind of like out of place where I was like, is this supposed to mean something?
That person does not matter, doesn't exist in the book. It was just for them to point out a woman can be a neuroscientist too. I'm like, shut up.
Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at Where Are You From Pod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyouFrom. Thanks, y'all.
The science piece of it is really interesting because I feel like the next middle part of the episode is all just about science, right? It's about the science experiments failing. It's about them talking about how nothing is working. It's about them like freaking out about their like life's work, which I have so many things to say about this. First of all, how did they cast so many beautiful people as scientists? Like, I'm not saying there are not beautiful people as scientists, but everybody beautiful? Like, that's
Bitch,
not...
Yes.
That's not correct.
I had so many qualms about that. Auggie is like a fucking gorgeous, like, runway model. I'm like, give me a break.
When she came on screen, I screamed and I was like, that's Lisa Rinna from Real Housewives of New York. Sorry, it just looks so much like her. I was like, but no, it's someone completely different. things that captured my interest. It was interesting to watch them talk about the science because they seem very, very, very concerned. And I'm like, they're very concerned about science. I've never seen anyone talk about it that way, as if it's their job. But of course it is their job, and I don't know any scientists, so maybe they do talk about it that way when their experiments fail. But they were just like so earnestly serious about like these experiments failing. And I was like, is this real?
Since you brought that up, that is another point that I felt like I had a little bit of qualm about. In the book, it's very heavily science focused. Like, he goes into whole like pages and pages explaining the science and the physics behind stuff and like why it matters. And I know that you can't just have a narrator on screen on a Netflix show explaining like, here's how science works. But I do think that when they were freaking out about science stuff on the first episode, you, especially as someone who hasn't read the book, probably was kind of like, I don't get it. Like, why does this matter? I'm kind of confused why you're making such a big deal about it. And you probably don't really understand why that woman approached Auggie to be like, stop doing your science, and then the countdown will go away. I guess this is a bit of a spoiler, sorry, but like basically in the book, all these scientists are committing suicide because they're all getting tormented by the aliens with the same like countdown thingy to try to bully them into stopping their research into whatever like specific field that they are specialized in. And the reason being two things. In the show, they say something like, this shit is like freaking out, and if that's true, then everything we know about science is false or whatever. And that's what they kind of present as like the reason why they're freaking out. And that is a part of what will develop. I won't ruin it. There's something with the aliens is going on that's kind of like messing with their science. But the reason why the threats are happening is because the aliens are trying to prevent progress from humankind in science. And so they're targeting specific scientists who are like experts in specific parts of fundamental like physics and stuff that would help catalyze like future scientific progress. They go into a whole thing about like where science is currently at, where we're stopped from like a human standpoint, where we should be if we wanted to reach things like being able to go into like hyperspeed and space and all that shit. But in the show, it's being very much glossed over because they don't have time, and like people probably don't have the patience to like understand real science. So I definitely felt like it was very surface level brushing on of like something about science is fucked up, and that's as much as we're gonna like go into it. Although I will say other alien movies like Annihilation, Arrival, Interstellar, like all these other science, you know, alien-y movies did a much better job, I think, of kind of like representing the science-y part of it in a compelling way without making you bored. So I do hope they develop that a little bit more on the show, because you're not getting why it matters when they don't go like deep enough.
Yeah, that's the thing. The concern was, I was like, oh, it's a lot. Well, I actually like, I feel like the rest of the episode after that is just Auggie trying to follow through the clues on her countdown thing. So I'm more interested in what you think about the crew that they put together. Asian girl, researcher, Auggie's like a materials scientist, black dude is also like some kind of theoretical physics researcher. Then you have a school teacher, and then a guy who makes chips.
Yeah, I mean, all these people are made up, so I have no real like feeling about it. I do feel like it's unnecessary to have this group, but I understand why they did it. I'm just hoping they have some sort of interesting reason to exist versus just so that they can cast a bunch of diverse people and also a beloved Game of Thrones actor. Like, they just kind of... It feels a little extraneous right now.
I was also like, I don't know, like, does your friend group look like that? Sometimes I'm like, this is a very successful friend group.
No one's friend group looks like that.
I think I have like one person like that in my friend group.
Well, I guess their whole like justification is they made some side comment about them all being like research assistants for the woman who killed herself. So I think that's how they're explaining how they like all know each other, but how about how you're all gorgeous and like genius people and perfectly colorful, diverse.
I just love that they made the scientists very beautiful, and then the two members of the group that were scientists are just kind of like schmuckety schmucks.
That's true. It's so true.
I think that's a form of fan service for the nerds to be like, you're beautiful. But I thought the friend thing was so interesting because I was like, I felt like it was to create interpersonal drama and to get the viewer to feel like, oh, this is like a friend group that I could belong to. But I'm like, that could never be my friend. That's not my friend group.
I think they're also just trying to hedge their risks because in the book, it is so focused on Wang Miao that, like, if you can't buy into his character, you probably are not going to finish the book. So, like, if Auggie doesn't resonate as, like, the one character and she's the only character you follow, you're not going to watch the show. Versus, like, Stranger Things, it's the group, but you fall in love with, like, one or two of the characters. You're like, oh, I'll watch it just for this kid. So they're probably hoping for that. If we throw enough characters into a group, you have to love one of them, right? But I will say, one of the things that I am very excited to see how they continue developing in the show is the video game. You only got to see like 30 seconds or whatever of that representation, but that's going to be a huge part of the show. Like in the book, you're constantly jumping back and forth between like real life and this virtual reality in the game. So I want to see how they develop that. My overall feeling is like they made a bunch of superfluous, like unnecessary changes to the book, which is normal for a movie, TV show adaptation. Do I think that most of those things are going to have like a material difference on whether or not it's going to be an enjoyable show? No, but I do think they're taking away suspense and tension by making the protagonist into a group instead of just one person. But I think they can still do a good enough job. And I'm interested to see where they go with it.
Yeah, final thoughts for me as well is similar. Like, I didn't read the books, but I've read the plot summary, so I generally know what is going to happen. And I think maybe that's why I didn't enjoy it as much, because I was like, oh, this is like high sci-fi. And then the first episode was largely like grounded in current reality, minus a couple of those like really shocking moments or the video game piece. So I was kind of like, oh, I was expecting a little bit more sci-fi. Like, I'm a sci-fi nerd. Like, give me the nerd things. I want to see the nerd things.
So I will say, I think you're feeling that because you read the Wikipedia and not the book. I also read the Wikipedia recently just to like refresh my memory about what happens, because I've actually read the first book like twice, but it's been at least a year since I reread that book. So the Wikipedia, as all plot summaries do, give you the plot in the most like logical and or chronological way for you to understand what is happening. That's not how the book goes. When I was reading it, I was like, oh, they explained this person this way, and like they explained that event happening this way. Like, yes, I guess that's what happened, but in the book, it's developed in a totally different way. So I will say the show is following more the way the book lays out these things. Like, they do cast a lot of fish hooks into the sea without you necessarily knowing where they were going with it, but it will all make sense later. And the sci-fi stuff, I will say again, like when I started the book, I didn't know what it was about, because people who have read the book, who love the book, don't want to spoil it. So they're like, you just have to read it. Like, it's going to get really, really interesting, and I can't tell you more. And you're like, okay. When the sci-fi stuff starts happening in the book, it doesn't stop. Then it's like a fucking like tsunami of sci-fi and craziness, and you're like, holy shit. So I think the show is trying to follow more that way and giving you the little seeds with like the video game and the universe winking at you, whatever thing.
Well, as we wrap up the episode, what in the episode surprised you or shocked you or particularly interested you?
I was pleasantly surprised by all the Chinese being like very good. You know what I mean? Like, Hollywood has developed where they stop casting just all these people who like can't actually speak the language they're supposed to be portraying. I believe it that they actually hired like all actual Chinese people. It shows. How about you?
I do have to say, at the middle-ish of the episode where they're doing the flashback, and I'm assuming that the female scientist has been betrayed by her love interest, I was like, you ratted her out? You gave her the book? That's so rude. But that was like the only thing where I was like, oh no, like I kind of thought it was going a different direction. I thought it was going to be like a caper into the thing and they discover what's happening there. And then I was like, oh, he sold her out. Like, oh.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of sad.
Well, listeners, thank you for joining us as we review the first episode of The Three Body Problem, now available on Netflix. We are not sponsored. Sponsor us, please. We'd love to know what you thought about the episode, if you binged your way through the whole series as well. So write us in.
And come back next week because we will have another fresh episode for you then. And until then,
再见, bitches.
bitches.